It's not every day that you get to share the dais with somebody like Zia, and I have to say I feel a little bit intimidated right now. So, forgive me in advance for any stammering or stuttering that might happen. But okay, so since we have Zia here, we of course have to hear a little bit about her own personal journey, especially given the fact that Zia became a lawyer in the 1970s, and not just in India, in Cambridge, and at Harvard. So Zia, if you can tell us a little bit about how that journey was. I mean, today, of course, it's no big deal when your daughter stands up and says, "Oh, I want to study law. I want to go to Cambridge. I want to go to Harvard." But how was it like in the 1970s for you?
So I landed up there. I think some people have heard this story, but quite reluctantly, because when I finished my college from Elphinstone, I was young and I wanted to marry Jaydev, the love of my life, as somebody said on the panel earlier. And my mother, who is a fairly strong woman, said, nothing doing. And within 3 weeks, she shipped me off to London. No admission in any college, nothing. She said, go find a college and go get yourself to do law. Because I wanted to do law. So I ended up in London. akka was over, that whole application program. So I scrambled into a college for a year called SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, and I spent 1 year in London learning law and having a blast. And then after 1 year, she said, this London won't do. You better go to Cambridge or Oxford. I said, just like that? She said, yeah, just like that. Go apply. So I applied and I got into Cambridge. And I did 2 years there. And I remember when my mother came to see my tutor, John Spencer, at my college, I think he figured that she was more ambitious for me than I was for myself. So he said, Mrs. Sorabji, your daughter will do very well. I don't think you have to worry. I think she's absolutely capable of a first class, but I am going to encourage her not to get a first class. She must get a 2-1 because she has to enjoy Cambridge. And my mother's face just fell because, overachievement was the order of the day. So I got a 2-1 and I was the cox in the boat and I went riding and I made friends who are still friends today and had a good time. Then after that I wanted to come back and marry my husband and she said, no, it's too soon. Go do an LLM. So I trotted off to do an LLM at Harvard. And that was actually the best year of my education because it was easy. The LLM was no big deal. You had not many courses. You met a lot of professors who had amazing insight. I remember there was one professor, Louis Sohn, who was in the bunker with Jack Kennedy when they were deciding the Cuba crisis. And I chose my topics the way I liked, freedom of press, this, that, and the other. Some of my professors are now Supreme Court judges. And I stayed in touch with quite a few people at Harvard. Then I finished my LLM, same request. And she said, no, you have to work in New York only. It'd be a very good experience. So I worked for 4 years at a firm which was then the largest law firm in the world, called Baker and McKenzie in Manhattan. And I think that's where I really got my grounding. And if you look at what has shaped my career, it was male mentors. My male mentor at Baker and McKenzie was fortunately a bachelor, so he had time for me. Didn't have a family to go back to, and was polite but ruthless in how he trained me. If there was something wrong, he would say, would you like to relook at that? Which meant I screwed up. Then if there was ever a meeting with clients, he would make sure even if I was a first or second year associate, he would take me along. I learned a lot through osmosis. I'm a fairly confident person, so I didn't think that I was stupid, but I knew I had a lot to learn. And I was open to the learning, and that gave me the grounding that I have for today. Then in my fourth year, I got mugged in New York. And I was walking down the street and I got mugged, and the guy pulled out a revolver and grabbed my bag, and I chased him and I caught him, and I took my bag back, and fortunately for me there was a undercover cop on the street. I was mad, I don't know what I was thinking. They caught the mugger. I went to court. I deposed against him. I got him put in jail. I did not recommend probation. My father then put his foot down and said she has to come back home. And if you ask Jaidev to wait too much longer, bye-bye Jaidev. So I came back, and then, even then, my mother said, no, Jaidev has to understand how hard you're going to be working as a lawyer. So you please continue and go to court. And at that time, there was no foreign exchange and FDI. And so I wore my band and gown and went to court every day. And that was the difficult part, because, I had not studied Indian law for a day in my life. I was England and America. So although it was similar, it was new. And, I was there with my peers who had done nothing but government law college, and they were doing well, and they were men. And here was this, I was thinner then, this young woman who clients were saying, she's going to argue my case? And, what about that guy there? So that was the tough part, I think, to get the confidence of my solicitors to brief me, and to really try and make the gender issue a non-issue. And my father gave me, who was a lawyer, gave me two pieces of advice. One, he said, always charge less. So you will get the brief. Just undercut all the men. If they're charging 100, charge 50. You don't need the money. You need to get the visibility and the space. And the second is, he said, always be over-prepared. As if the senior who leads you is not going to show up. So every time I had a matter, I would painstakingly read up the whole brief, and 80% of the time the matter would be adjourned. So all that time and energy of sitting up till 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock at night, reading all those hundreds of pages was very disappointing and annoying. And my father used to say, your every prayer at night should be, may your senior fall sick, so that you can argue, right? So I remember there was a time when there was a senior who I adored called Ghulam Vanwati, who's passed. He was leading me, and one day he said, I'm really busy. I won't be able to argue this matter today. So he saw the smile on my face, and I said, okay. And he said, you're going to argue? I said, if you let me, I'm fully ready. So he was so nervous as to whether he should let me argue or not argue. He sort of came halfway into the case when I had started arguing, sat next to me. And then the judges were very supportive of young women lawyers. There were 2 or 3 at that time who could actually open their mouths. So my early journey in India, Neha, was difficult. My journey in America was a blast. I was young, single, Manhattan, couldn't ask for more. But then finally when I got married, then all the pressures that the women in the room have gone through, I went through as well. I spat out 3 daughters between 1986 and 1990. I had a great mother-in-law who lived with us, who basically said, do your work, I'm here. Her husband was a lawyer and a judge, so she understood the pressures. And of course, if your mother-in-law is looking after your children, how can your husband complain, right? So I had that added advantage. And then you slowly develop a sense of self-assurance, because you know that you are prepared and you are competent. I think the main thing about early careers and coming back, which is what this platform partly promotes, is the diffidence which gets into you for having stayed away for long, or am I really going to be able to catch up, or am I good enough? But you are good enough and you can catch up. And even if you don't catch up immediately, you know what? It's fine. Are you happy with what you do? Are you happy to be engaged back into a profession? Are you still proud of yourself? Do you think you have still something intellectually to contribute to your workplace and to yourself? And I think that is really the main driver that brings women in the workplace, keeps them in the workplace, or brings them back to the workplace. When I had my 3 children, it was easy. I was in court, so I just didn't take briefs. For my first one, I was out of action 3 months. For my second, I was out of action 6 months. And for my third, I was out of action 4 months. But I wanted to come back. I missed the adrenaline. I loved being in court. I'm fairly argumentative. And as my male peers used to say, Zia gets pregnant all the time and she gets all these pregnancy orders. She walks in like that and, no good judge can't feel embarrassed about seeing this twaddling woman come in, and it's a complete discriminatory, unfair advantage. So they used to call it Zia's pregnancy orders. So I said, what the hell, get what you can.
That's awesome, because we've been talking a lot about it today, which is like this whole, people wonder that, okay, should we do this positive discrimination? I like to call it positive discrimination. Yeah, that men are now complaining that what is this? You only want to hire women, and what is this? You're running so many programs for women, etc. And we always say that, okay, fine, once you're 50-50 in the workplace, we will stop doing it. Yeah, but what do you think is required to really push more women like this to be able to perform, stay in the workplace, or restart?
So I think the main thing is staying. The joining is the easy part, right? It's the multitasking and who we are. Mothers, daughters-in-law, and we have to try and juggle all these roles. And that is what makes most women, or quite a lot of women, leave the workplace for a while. There are some stats which say that India's leaky pipeline is 48%. 48% of our women who join the workforce drop out of the workforce. And there are multiple reasons for that. Too much travel, traditional customs which your household feels you have to. I mean, why should you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to prepare a tiffin for your husband?
And for everybody in the house, yes.
I've never figured it. I've never done it in my life. And I've never entered the kitchen in my life. Maybe 10 times in all these years, because not my job. It's somebody else's job. So I feel that when we are women who are trying to squeeze every minute of our time, we should be ruthlessly outsourcing what we don't need to do. If we don't need to do it, just don't do it. I mean, you can get cut vegetables and cooked vegetables and everything is possible. And, you don't love your husband more because you're sitting and doing, that frying stuff for him. And you don't have to love everybody more because you have to order the rice or the wheat. Someone else can see the rice is getting over, they'll order it, right? What's the big deal? So I don't do all that. And whatever extra time I get, I spend it on things that I think I should be doing. I think, Neha, this audience knows about the capital G called guilt. I don't think any of us have gone away from it. Some deal with it better, some don't deal with it. Some deal with it okay. Personally, I think I did let my family down in many cases, my daughter especially. My husband was always there, and in a heartbeat, they'll choose him over me, I'm sure. But it was the cost that I had to pay in the 70s and the 80s for being a woman and wanting to be in court and then recognized. And then when India opened up to do corporate law, again as a woman, when everyone around you was a man. Today it's so different, and your platform is so unique in that, there is real opportunity for women who've taken a break or want to choose what they want to do. It could be something totally different. Those choices were not there at that time. And so my guidance to this audience is, stay the course at whatever time you feel is right for you to return. And you will return if you are passionate about what you do. If it is chalta, then you will say, theek hai, I'm not earning that much, I'm spending half of it on nannies and travel and tuitions and guilt. So why do it? So it's the passion that keeps you going. I'm 67 years old. I still enjoy going to work. A lot of my partners say I should be sitting in my room and coming out only to distribute chocolates. But I think I can contribute more than that. So it's your sense of self-pride as a woman that keeps you going. And if you have reached a certain stage, as a lot of your panelists have, in an organization, it is their duty to understand the pain of the lessons they've gone through and to make sure that the young women, we don't speak out. A lot of us just say we're leaving. We don't really, like one of the panelists said, she went and fired her boss. Very few of those, right? We're quiet leavers. And I think it's up to us as women mentors to anticipate. So if a woman comes to me in our law firm and says, I'm pregnant, I couldn't be happier, and I take out my parchi and I says, this is now what will happen to you since you're pregnant. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and have I missed anything? And if that is the case, can we bespoke anything for you? There are different problems, right, for different women. Sometimes it's a little more flexibility. Sometimes it's a little more, understanding that I normally just cut the work without the organization knowing it. So if somebody has to do 10 assignments a year and they're in a position where they need more time, I make it 6. And quietly. And I think since I lead the firm, most men won't be able to complain because I will simply ask them if they were breastfeeding or changing nappies or, So that, I think, is what we should tell our male colleagues if they start to make a fuss about discrimination. And I remember once there was a guy who said, I really need paternity leave. I said, really? Are you sure? So he said, yeah, I really need at least 10 days of paternity leave. I said, okay. So he went off for 10 days and he came back and I said, how was it? He said, it was just great. I said, what did you do? He said, I went to Thailand. So I said, end of paternity leave. This is what you're doing. But I think men are different now. They're much more involved in the child rearing. So I think it's one step at a time, Nia. I think yours is such a great initiative because it gives an opportunity to millions of women. And we hold up half the sky. We are part of the talent that India depends on, according to me. And I'm a Baha'i by religion. And one of our religious commandments, not a guidance, is that men and women are equal. So my poor father, who was not a Baha'i, and my mother, who is a Baha'i, my father had no chance because any time, any opportunity was there. So I was the eldest girl. I wanted to be a lawyer. So mommy said, yeah, she'll be a lawyer. So Papa said, okay, but then what about Jahangir? He's my eldest son. So she said, we have one lawyer, he'll be a doctor. So he became a doctor. So there was no competition amongst our siblings for who was the lawyer. And I remember my father saying, after you get married to Jaidev, why don't you keep the name Sorabji? You know, people know who Sorabji is. So I said, very good idea. So I asked Jaidev, so can I stay Zia Sorabji? So he said, you stay in your father's house only if you want to stay as Zia Sorabji. Don't have to come, see? So I changed my name, and then my father said, how about go and ask him if you can be, so men can't talk to each other, right? So he said, go and ask him if you can be Zia Sorabji Modi. So
And
I
wait, this is
asked,
when? This is in
yeah.
1980s. Huh? Please keep this in mind.
So I told Jaidev, how does that sound? He said, okay. So I used to sign my name Zia Modi. So he said, now you change your signature, ZJ for Jaidev, Modi. So my signature now is ZJ Modi. Daddy flew out of the door. So the good part was that, you know, many people who didn't know my background knew me just as Zia Modi, which always helped because even though you recognized the genius of the shadow you were under, there were many opportunities where you could be your own person and prove your own self. And I think that's the lesson again to the women in the audience. Be yourself. You'd be surprised how much it's appreciated. And you know, it's Venus and Mars. Today it's still Venus and Mars. Today if a young man makes a mistake and comes to me, he'll just start justifying it and saying, ye, wo, iska galti, uska galti. A young woman comes, she wants to commit suicide. And she starts by, you know, saying, I'm really sorry. And that's just the way the world is. We are different. I think we have dollops of EQ, which gets us along the way. And I think all this will go into, 20 years later, Neha, when you have this session again, you will see a very different lot of young women. Because today fathers are much more invested in their daughters than before. The earlier generation was paisa de do, get married into a good
Or
family.
rather, dowry de do. Prepare for
Paisa de
dowry.
do, same thing. And, today I have so many fathers calling me and asking me if I could have a half an hour session with their girls and give them career guidance. And even though time is the enemy, I never say no to that. Because that if I have achieved something, I have a duty to guide and inspire and allow young women to gain and understand the pitfalls in the journey and be ready for it. So
Now I get it why she did not say no for this also. And thank you for that, Zia, for making time for this. Now, you mentioned you have 3 daughters. And from what I understand, you are also a grandmother.
I have 5 grandchildren, 4 are boys.
Okay. So how do you think, like now when you're seeing your daughters growing up, you know, they are getting into this whole maternity phase, they are bringing up little children,
Yes.
you're seeing your grandchildren, how do you see this whole landscape changing for your daughter's generation and then your grandson's generations?
So since I have 3 girls, my husband has to invest in the 3 girls only. So there is no question of this or that. They're all girls. They've all been educated to be able to have a career for themselves. Again, I think that's something different. Families are willing to invest in their girl child much more than before. And so I think as parents, what we want is independence for them, professional ethics, so that they do things the right way, don't make us ashamed of anything that they do, and grow their businesses in the best way they can. And one step at a time again, you know, and they have to like what they do or they'll drop out. So that's the real thing. How do you encourage the young woman to really fixate on what she is going to have to sacrifice a lot of other things for?
And what about your grandson's generations? What do you think is going to be very different by the time, you know, they grow up, they're graduating, they're entering the workplace?
They'll be aggressive men. the grandsons.
You think they'll still be?
Of course. Because, they are also brought up to get the best education. They are trained to be outspoken and aggressive. Hopefully they'll do well when they grow up in life. Only thing is that, I hope that they have the same sense of respect for their wives and be proud of them and encourage them. And hopefully their mothers will be role models.
Okay, that's amazing. On that note, I'm going to open the floor to some questions from the audience. Right here. And do introduce yourself. Just 1 second, the mic is coming to you.
Hello, Zia ma'am. Such a delight to see you again. I especially came for this event because I wanted to have an interaction with you. So my question is, everybody is busy empowering women, but who's doing the job of making the men handle these empowered women?
I think that men are starting to realize, maybe not as quickly as we would like, that they can't afford to lose female talent. It's not easy if a lot of your bright people working in your organization are women, to see them drop out one after the other. And so I think HR helps in basically managing how the men should look at it. I think men are still a little embarrassed or nervous or diffident about having these conversations. And that will change, but I think it's there right now. So I think that most HR organizations should take the lead in anticipating what is happening in the workplace. And there was one very good example that I never forgot. There was a CEO, I forget her name, Angela, I think, of a really male-dominated company called Anglo American. It was a mining company, and she was the female and she was the CEO. And I met her on one of the occasions, and I said, fantastic, and what do you do about making sure women stay in the workforce in your company? So she said, I give my middle managers KRAs. And those KRAs are also dependent on retention of women. So when the year starts, how many women in your group? When the year ends, how many have you added? How many have you lost? What did you do to retain them? And if your supervisor thinks you haven't done a good enough job, you lose money. That says everything, right? So she made it a financial outcome if women left for the wrong reason. If there was obviously somebody had to get married, as they said, and move, or somebody had aging parents or sickness, fine. But just to leave without a sensible conversation as to how the organization could make it work for each woman was the KRA that she set. And I think that if we have our male CEOs, because the C-suite is still male-dominated, get a bit of training from the HR as to how it's fine to have these discussions, not to be embarrassed about it, because they've been fathers, right? They've seen what's happened. And I think, as I say, in 20 years, I give it 20 years, you'll see villages change.
Yeah, no, and I've seen it in the last 9.5 years already, Zia. And in fact, on that note, I'm very happy to let you know that on our new platform, we've actually, for all these 9 years, our user zone used to only have women candidates on it. And then when we relaunched our platform, and we had a lot of heated debates and discussions about this internally, we decided, especially for that reason, that we have to let the men in. That men have to be part of the conversation instead of saying that, oh, this is a women's conversation. This conversation can only go forward if the men are part of it. So we've actually created a separate role called For Her, where we are getting the men in to also, for example, for them to understand what are the challenges that women are going through, right? And how can they be part of the solution instead of being part of the problem? So 20 years.
There is a Australian company called Macquarie, and they have a program which is very interesting. You might want to look at it. It's called Male Champions of Change. Male Champions of Change. They've put the onus on the men. So that's interesting because they figured out that, the decision makers, even today, are mostly men. And so if they are become champions of change, then top down.
Great, thank you. I see time's up, and I know that you are waiting for lunch. So I'm going to say a very big thank you to Zia for being with us today, and thank you to all of you for being such a receptive audience.